I have identified a specific power hidden within those who walk alone. While society sees them as outcasts or broken, I see them as the most psychologically formidable individuals who ever lived. What I discovered about loners who keep no friends wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous enough that I have warned my colleagues to handle these individuals with extreme caution. Society judges the loner as antisocial, broken, or damaged. My research revealed something that threatens the foundation of how we organize human relationships. I discovered that forced socialization is the real sickness. The loner represents something evolution has been trying to create for thousands of years. The question isn't why some people walk alone. The question is why everyone else is so terrified of solitude that they'll tolerate toxic relationships rather than face themselves. My clinical files reveal a disturbing patterns. The individuals who kept no friends weren't suffering from social deficits. They had developed immunity to the most powerful force that controls human behavior, groupthink, the need for validation from others, and the psychological chains that keep most people obedient to collective unconscious agreements they never consciously chose. The loner cannot be manipulated by social pressure because they genuinely do not seek validation from the group. I call this psychological independence. Most people think they make their own choices, but my research proves otherwise. Through my concept of the collective unconscious, I have shown that most human behavior is unconsciously synchronized with group expectations. People dress alike, think alike, and make choices that feel personal, but are actually collective patterns they absorbed without awareness. Think about the last time you made a decision based on what others might think. What career would look impressive? What relationship would seem acceptable? What opinions would keep you included in your social circle? Most people make dozens of these calculations daily without realizing they've handed control of their lives to invisible judges who never asked for that power. The loner exists outside this system, not because they're rebelling against it, because they never plugged into it in the first place. Their brain developed differently. While other children learned to regulate their nervous system through social approval, the loner's nervous system learned to self-regulate through solitude. When other kids needed the group's laughter to feel okay, loner felt okay alone. When other teenagers needed constant validation through friendships, the loner found validation through internal coherence. This creates something that terrifies those who control through social pressure, an individual who cannot be threatened with exclusion because they never valued inclusion. They are someone who watches the group without needing to join it. I documented this pattern across dozens of cases, and what I found made me realize I was studying something more dangerous than mental illness. I was studying the only humans who had escaped the invisible prison that holds everyone else captive. The loner is a dangerous observer. Similar to my empath archetype, the loner watches and collects data on human behavior with scientific precision. While everyone else participates in social theater, performing their roles and maintaining their masks, the loner sits outside the performance and sees the machinery that makes it work. They see the lies people tell themselves, the contradictions between what people say and what they do, and the patterns that repeat across different groups, different relationships, and different social systems. While others are busy performing, the loner is learning. I realized that loners develop a level of social intelligence that exceeds what most people achieve in entire lifetimes. They develop it as observers, not participants. The loner notices that the person preaching family values is cheating on their spouse. They see that the friend who claims to support you subtly undermines you in group settings. They recognize that the colleague who smiles in meetings is sabotaging projects behind closed doors. These observations aren't cynicism, they are pattern recognition, unfiltered by the need to maintain social harmony. This observational position gives them access to truths that make participation impossible. Once you see how the game works, you can't pretend you don't see it. Once you notice the patterns, you can't unsee them. The loner's knowledge becomes their isolation, because speaking these truths threatens the collective agreements that keep groups functioning. Every group has unspoken rules about what can and cannot be acknowledged. The loner sees these rules clearly and finds them absurd. I have written extensively about how groups unconsciously agree to ignore certain realities to maintain cohesion. The family that never mentions a father's drinking, the workplace that never acknowledges the toxic manager, the friend group that pretends not to notice how one person always plays the victim. These collective denial agreements keep the group stable, but they require everyone's participation. The loner, who points out the obvious, becomes the problem, not because they're wrong, but because they're breaking the agreement. Most people confuse the loner with someone who is lonely. I have been obsessed with clarifying this distinction because I saw how much damage this confusion created. Loneliness is a defect, painful state where someone craves connection they cannot achieve. Loneliness is suffering caused by unwanted isolation. The lonely person seeks invitations to events they don't enjoy just to avoid being alone. They tolerate disrespect from friends because having bad friends feels better than having no friends. Solitude, however, is a superpower. These souls aren't broken, they are alchemists in progress, seeking to turn the lead of overwhelm into the gold of clarity. Solitude is a chosen state where someone has access to their own consciousness without the interference of collective expectations. It is when your nervous system finally stops processing everyone else's emotions and expectations and gets to experience its own authentic signals. In solitude, you discover what you actually think, not what you've been trained to think. You learn what you genuinely enjoy, what you're supposed to enjoy. You access your authentic preferences, values, and desires. The lonely person is broken by isolation. The solitary person is strengthened by it. I spent years studying the difference. I found that true loners don't experience loneliness the way others do. They experience clarity, relief, freedom from the exhausting performance of social acceptability. Where others feel empty in solitude, the loner feels full. Where others feel anxious without social input, the loner feels calm. When a loner is forced into social situations, they don't feel connection. They feel interference, like static disrupting a clear signal. This isn't pathology. This is a different nervous system configuration that processes social input as noise rather than nourishment. The social rituals that others find comforting feel like elaborate wastes of energy. The performance of interest in topics that don't matter creates exhaustion rather than engagement. I observed that loners often leave social situations feeling drained rather than energized, not because they're introverted in the conventional sense, because they're processing the gap between what people say and what people mean. They're watching everyone perform their social roles while simultaneously tracking the authentic emotions bleeding through the performance. This dual processing is exhausting. Solitude isn't just preferred, it's necessary for psychological recovery. I discovered that loners are often the only ones brave enough to face their own dark side. I call this the shadow, the parts of yourself that you've been taught to deny, suppress, and project onto others. Most people spend their entire lives running from their shadow, hiding in groups where they can point at others and say, that's where the evil lives. That's where the weakness lies, not in me. The group provides endless opportunities for shadow projection. You can stay comfortably unaware of your own capacity for cruelty by focusing on how cruel others are. You can avoid examining your own dishonesty by judging how dishonest others are. You can deny your own insecurities by mocking others for theirs. The group becomes a hall of mirrors where everyone projects their shadow onto everyone else, and no one has to face their own darkness. The loner doesn't have this luxury. When you spend significant time alone, you eventually meet everything you've been running from: your capacity for cruelty, your selfishness, your fears, your weaknesses, everything the group taught you was unacceptable to acknowledge. In solitude, there's no one else to blame, no one else to compare yourself to, no one else to use as a distraction from your own psychological reality. I found that loners who successfully integrate their shadow become psychologically stronger than people who hide in groups. Because once you've faced your own darkness and survived, you're no longer afraid of it. You're no longer controlled by the fear of having it exposed. You become immune to shame as a control mechanism. You've already looked at the worst parts of yourself and decided you can live with them. This acceptance creates unshakable psychological stability. The person who has integrated their shadow knows they're capable of selfishness, so accusations of selfishness don't destroy them. They know they're capable of cruelty, so recognizing cruelty in themselves doesn't shatter their self-image. They've accepted their full humanity, light and dark together. This acceptance paradoxically makes them less dangerous than people who deny their shadow, because they're conscious of their capacity for harm and can choose differently. This shadow integration creates what I call psychological sovereignty. The loner who has faced their darkness cannot be manipulated by threats of exposure. They already know what they're capable of. They've already accepted it. This makes them unblackmailable, unshameable, uncontrollable through the normal social mechanisms that keep most people obedient. I documented this process in my own life. During my confrontation with the unconscious, spent years in solitude facing psychological contents that would have destroyed most people. I saw visions that could have been diagnosed as psychosis. I experienced emotions that could have led to a breakdown. I confronted parts of myself that contradicted everything I wanted to believe about my own character. I didn't run from these experiences. I studied them. I integrated them. I emerged from that experience fundamentally changed, no longer afraid of my own mind, no longer dependent on external validation, psychologically complete in a way that most people never achieve. My work on the shadow, on archetypes, on the individuation process, all came from my willingness to spend years alone with psychological contents that terrified me. The loner's psychological development follows this same pattern. Solitude forces shadow integration. Shadow integration creates sovereignty. Sovereignty threatens every system built on controlling people through shame and social pressure. This is where my research becomes truly dangerous, because the loner who has integrated their shadow and achieved psychological sovereignty reaches a point where they can make decisions that terrify the group. They can walk away from toxic systems without fear. They can expose truths without concern for social consequences. They can act on their own values, even when those values contradict collective expectations. I call this the snap, not a psychological breakdown, a moment of absolute clarity where the loner decides to act because they don't need the group's approval. They're capable of making choices that the group finds incomprehensible or threatening. Truth tellers who risk their reputations to name what everyone knows but no one will say. People who walk away from prestigious positions because the work contradicts their values. Individuals who choose integrity over inclusion even when inclusion would be easier, safer, and more profitable. The group punishes these actions severely because they threaten the collective agreements that keep the system stable. Organizations exile those who speak out. Social circles ostracize truth tellers. Families scapegoat members who refuse to maintain the collective denial. The loner who has achieved psychological sovereignty cannot be controlled by punishment that relies on social pain. Exclusion doesn't hurt when you never valued inclusion. Shame doesn't work when you've already integrated your shadow. Reputation damage means nothing when you never derived your identity from external validation. This makes the loner dangerous because they're evil, but because they're free. Freedom is the ultimate threat to systems built on control. A person who cannot be manipulated, shamed, or coerced into compliance is a person who can dismantle entire power structures simply by refusing to participate. They can say no to opportunities everyone else scrambles to accept. They can walk away from relationships everyone else tolerates. They can question beliefs everyone else defends without examination. I spent decades studying this phenomenon, and I reached a conclusion that still makes many uncomfortable. The loner isn't broken. The loner is evolved. They represent what human consciousness can become when it develops outside the constraints of collective, unconscious programming. They're not missing something that others have. They're accessing something most people never find. Most people are running code they downloaded from their culture without ever examining whether that code serves them. Beliefs about what success means, assumptions about what relationships should look like, rules about what emotions are acceptable, and scripts about how life should unfold. All of this programming runs in the background, determining choices that feel personal, but are actually collective patterns repeated across millions of lives. The loner is someone who rejected the download and wrote their own operating system. This makes them incompatible with standard social infrastructure. It also makes them capable of innovations that groupthink could never produce. Because they're not constrained by collective agreements, about what's possible. They can see solutions others cannot imagine. Because they're not invested in maintaining the status quo, they can advocate for changes others fear. I found that history's greatest breakthroughs often came from loners. Artists who worked in isolation for years before their work found recognition. Scientists who pursued questions everyone else dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. Philosophers who thought thoughts no one wanted to hear. Inventors who built prototypes in solitary workshops while others called them crazy. These individuals could see possibilities that groupthink made invisible, because they weren't constrained by collective agreements about what was acceptable to imagine. The loner's legacy isn't loneliness, it's liberation. Not just for themselves, for everyone who witnesses someone living according to their own values rather than collective expectations. Every loner who achieves psychological sovereignty proves that it's possible, that you can survive outside the group, you can face your shadow and integrate it, and that freedom from collective control is achievable if you're willing to pay the price of solitude. I understood this deeply because I lived it. My break with Freud left me professionally isolated. My former colleagues dismissed me. My theoretical innovations were ridiculed. My confrontation with the unconscious left me psychologically alone in territories no one else could navigate with him. That solitude produced some of the most profound psychological insights in human history, concepts that revolutionized how we understand human consciousness, and ideas that still shape psychology, spirituality, philosophy. The loner who keeps no friends isn't avoiding connection. They are protecting their consciousness from interference so they can access truths that collective participation makes invisible. They're not failing at social relationships. They're succeeding at something most people never attempt: the development of a fully individuated self capable of thinking its own thoughts, feeling its own feelings, and living according to its own values. The world needs loners. Not because they're better than others, because they see what others cannot see. They think thoughts others are afraid to think. They ask questions others are programmed not to ask. They live possibilities others are too controlled to attempt. Every system needs people who can step outside it and evaluate whether it still serves its stated purpose, or whether it's become self-perpetuating regardless of outcomes. If you're someone who keeps no friends, my message to you is simply, you're not broken. You're not defective. You're not missing something everyone else has. You're accessing something most people never find. Your solitude isn't a problem to solve, it's a strength to protect. Your inability to conform isn't a weakness, it's immunity to the most powerful control system humans ever created. Your discomfort in social situations isn't anxiety that needs treatment. It's your nervous system telling you that performing a false self is more damaging than being alone with your authentic self. The dangerous truth I discovered is that the loner represents human potential, freed from collective limitations. And that freedom, sovereignty, that psychological independence is exactly what every control system fears most. Because loners want to destroy society, but because their mere existence proves that society's control mechanisms are optional, that you can choose differently, that you can live according to your own values, that you can be psychologically complete without needing validation from people who never took the time to understand themselves. Loner isn't dangerous because they're evil. They're dangerous because they're free. And freedom, I realized, is contagious. Every person who achieves psychological sovereignty through solitude and shadow integration creates permission for others to attempt the same journey. This is why groups punish loners so severely, not because loners harm anyone, because their existence threatens the collective agreements that keep everyone else controlled.